So it's my pleasure to introduce Luke McGuire, assistant professor in this department, the Geosciences department. Luke arrived in 2016 and has established a world-class group focused on post-fire erosion and the landscape evolution resulting from post-fire erosion. These are topics that are increasingly impactful and resonant with each passing year in the Western United States and around the world. Luke has undergraduate degrees in geology and math from Bucknell, where his father taught math for many years. He has a PhD from U of A in applied math. He went on to do a Mendenhall postdoctoral fellowship at the USGS in Golden, Colorado, and began, as I said, at the U of A as an assistant professor 4 years ago. His first major award was a Bisgrove Scholarship in 2017, and that's an award that is reserved for rising stars among the 3 state universities. And more recently, he's obtained funding from NSF focused on the role of debris flows and landscape evolution over geologic timescales. His CV, which might not be current, but it's probably close to being current, lists 31 co-authored papers at this stage of his career. I'm proud to call him a colleague. He's a true craftsperson in the work that he does. His work is very detail-oriented while never losing track of the big picture science questions whose answers are likely to be transformative. So thank you, Luke, for agreeing to share your work with us today. And the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, John, for that kind introduction. I'm going to talk today about a topic that, as John mentioned, is, I think, becoming increasingly more relevant and impactful. The photo that you're all looking at here is a photo taken of the Bighorn Fire moving over the Catalina Mountains this summer. And a lot of my talk today will focus on kind of the short-term implications of the types of disturbance created by wildfire and some of the natural hazard implications for that. But I'm also going to touch on how this work is relevant to processes that occur over much longer timescales and how that might impact landscape evolution. And so I invite you, as we go through this talk, to kind of think more generally about these types of disturbance events and how many hundreds and thousands of them may affect landscapes over longer time periods. And I'll kind of hint at some of the ways in which I think that happens as we go through the talk. But like I said, it'll be focused mostly on short timescales and hazards. And before I get started, I need to make sure that I acknowledge work that's been done on these projects by various co-authors and collaborators over the years. Folks from the USGS, Hui Tang, who's a former postdoc of mine, now at GFZ in Potsdam, Ann Uberg from the Arizona Geological Survey, and current and former graduate students, Olivia Hoke, Alex Gore, and Carissa Raymond. So it's no secret that California has been on fire for a month or two now with no immediate end in sight. And they're not only seeing a large number of fires, but they're seeing fires that are somewhat unprecedented, at least in the last several decades, in terms of their size. You can see here some of the fires that are currently burning in California. 5 of them are kind of in the top 6 in terms of size that we've seen in the last several decades. So that kind of illustrates the magnitude of this problem. And although less publicized, we had a pretty active fire season here in Arizona as well. You see here in this image on the left, all of the outlines of active fire perimeters. This is as of a week ago, and these perimeters have definitely grown since then. You can see all of the fires in addition to the Bighorn Fire down here in Arizona. There were a lot in the Tonto this year. And along with this come post-fire hazards. So even after the flames are out, that doesn't mean that the hazards from the fire are over. And in some ways, they're really just beginning. This is one example of what can happen. This is the result of a rainstorm that occurred after the Thomas Fire in early 2018 in California, just outside of Santa Barbara. The Thomas Fire burned a lot of the mountains up here above the community of Montecito. And several weeks after the fire burned that area, a fairly intense rainstorm moved over the burn scar, producing debris flows in 6 or 7 different canyons that then ran down over this alluvial fan through fairly developed areas and ran out several kilometers into the ocean. So when I talk about debris flows here, I want you to think about something like flowing concrete that's also moving a lot of trees and large boulders that it kind of uses as battering rams. And here's some images on the right to kind of help you calibrate as to what we're talking about. So this is, obviously presents a hazard to both infrastructure and human life. And these flows are not only mobile just on steep slopes, these are fairly gently sloping alluvial fans. And these flows can remain mobile in certain circumstances, even under those conditions, and pose a serious threat. So these types of disturbances caused by fire really matter in creating much more extreme hydrologic and geomorphic responses to fairly typical rainstorms. Disturbance also matters over much longer timescales. A perfect illustration of this is a study that was done by John Pelletier and his former graduate student Caitlin Oram in the Valle Caldera in northern New Mexico. And what they found was that when they looked at long-term denudation rates, they could really only close the denudation rate budget when they accounted for the short-term impacts of infrequent fire on accelerating erosion rates. So you see here on the left, fire-affected erosion rates, many orders of magnitude greater than nearby watersheds that were unaffected by the fire. So even though severe fire may only occur in this and other landscapes in the Western US every couple hundred years, the erosion that occurs in the immediate aftermath of these events can be so substantial that it really accounts for 50 to 90% of total erosion over timescales of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. To show you an example of this that's far less quantitative but a little bit closer to home, here's an example of the what happened after the Woodbury fire, which burned in the Superstition Mountains just east of Phoenix. I'm going to show you a series of Google Earth images. This is from before the fire. This is a kind of a typical Sonoran desert plant community here that you're seeing. So something that you might see also in lower elevation portions of the Catalina Mountains. This is fortuitously a photo of the same area after the fire, but before it rained. And so you can see that State Route 88 here was essentially used as a fire break. Everything above the road burned, everything below the road remained unburned. And this set up kind of a nice natural experiment to see what would happen on either side of this canyon here when it started to rain. It looks really black and gray and white here because this is all ash from the fire. Now, here's what happened after one rainstorm in September. A fairly large rainstorm, maybe a 15, 25-year recurrence interval storm. You see all these white streaks on the hill slopes. These are gullies that were eroded and exposed new unweathered material. A lot of that material that moved kind of got some of it was deposited down here in these channels. You can see how much they widened, how we get deposition down here on these fans and kind of choke this channel down here with additional sediment. And I'm going to toggle back and forth between these images a couple of times. And what I want you to pay attention to in particular is notice the difference in the magnitude of the response from the burned area relative to the unburned area. So you can see that, there's a couple of these stream channels in the unburned area, they light up and you can tell that, some sediment was moving around in there. New stuff got deposited in this channel. But we're really talking about orders of magnitude less sediment being transported in the unburned side relative to the burned side. And I think that contrast is fairly striking and representative of what we see in these types of burned areas when they get substantial rainfall. In addition to disturbance mattering in general, process also matters. And one reason why process matters on short time scales is that when I say process, I mean, are we talking about a flood flow? Floods, water moves like a Newtonian fluid. Debris flows, they don't act like that. They're a different beast. And they are different because they contain a lot of sediment. And there's also some self-organization that kind of goes on in these types of flows where a lot of the really coarse material moves to the front and the side of the flow. And you get these really large bouldery snouts when these debris flows move down through channels. And that results in instantaneous discharge rates and flow depths, peak flow depths, that are much higher than what you would see in a typical flood in that same area. This leads these flows to go over bank a lot more frequently, and it can also lead to these channels clogging with sediment and then leading to flows that avulse and kind of go into areas where they don't typically travel. One example of that you see down here in this map of inundation zones for the debris flows after the Thomas fire. The brown areas here are areas where the debris flows traveled and inundated. And you see here, not positive what exactly happened here, but it looks like there was an avulsion event up high on this alluvial fan, and could have had a flow go over bank and traverse, across this fan down into this adjacent channel here. So this is just an illustration of the fact that when you have these changes in process, we're not just talking about semantics, but we're talking about real differences in how they behave, and that has real world implications for hazard mitigation. You can see here a couple of USGS folks marveling at the fact that this flow rafted a 1 meter diameter boulder roughly 2 meters up and wedged it in between these trees. And then you can see kind of some of the devastating effects of these flows here in the background with this structure. Process also matters, no surprise, over geologic time. One example of that, of a change in process as we go from one part of the landscape to another, is shown here on the left, where we have a U-shaped valley. This is what we often see in glacial terrain. This is a standard signature of a valley that was eroded by a glacier. And then we have a transition here to a V-shaped valley where there's a shift in process dominance from glacial erosion to fluvial or water-driven erosion. And we can recognize these transitions and use that to help us interpret landscapes and how they've evolved. Debris flows and floods, like I just mentioned, have some key differences. And so it's not surprising at all to suspect that we should be able to see signals of the transition from water-dominated flow to debris-dominated flow across the landscape. For example, as we move from steep slopes where debris flows may be more common to lower gradient channel reaches where they might be less common. But we know surprisingly little about certain aspects of this process. And one key area where we needed to make progress is in refining the threshold for where we transition from water-dominated flow to debris-dominated flow. And like I mentioned, since process matters, this isn't just a matter of semantics, but we need to figure this out. And when I talk about this process transition here, I'm talking about a particular class of debris flows, and that's debris flows that are initiated when water concentrates on steep slopes and rapidly mobilizes a large amount of sediment. That's in contrast to debris flows that form as a result of shallow landslides. So I just want to make that distinction clear. So another way that debris flows can form is when you get water that infiltrates into soil, and then you get a sufficient amount of water in the soil column that it reduces the frictional resistance holding that soil in place, and you get kind of a mass failure of some chunk of hill slope material. Given the right conditions, that material can kind of fluidize as it moves down slope, and that can result in a debris flow. In this talk, I'm really focused on debris flows that are generated by having sufficient amounts of runoff on steep slopes. These types of debris flows have been studied before, typically in small-scale laboratory experiments. You can see here kind of a diagram where someone has mapped out these different regimes of sediment transport. And shield stress here over on the left, I don't really want to get bogged down into details, but this is essentially just a non-dimensionalized version of shear stress. And you can think of it as just being synonymous with flow depth. On the left, think of this y-axis as down here at the bottom, not much flow moving, not much water flowing through the channel. And then up here at the top, a lot of water flowing through your channel. We can think of it as being that simple for today. And then we have slope on the x-axis. And so obviously, you know, if you keep the slope constant and you increase the amount of water that's flowing through your channel, at some point you're going to hit a transition where you're able to start picking up sediment and the water is able to move it. So that's kind of this transition from no motion to fluvial transport. Then at some point, if you continue to increase the amount of water flowing through the system, you imagine that you might get to a point where you can pick up so much sediment so quickly that you transition to a type of debris flow regime. You may also imagine that if you keep flow kind of constant and you increase the slope, eventually you get to a point where you're going to be able to transport sediment so fast that you also transition from you know, either a fluvial transport regime or a no motion regime into a debris flow regime. And this transition from no motion to fluvial has been extensively studied, but the transition from no motion to debris flow and fluvial to debris flow has been studied much less. And it's particularly challenging to do in a laboratory for a number of reasons, given the scale at which debris flows typically form and the types of material that are typically involved in the formation of those flows. So, you know, there aren't very many natural experiments for studying this transition. And so I'm going to spend, you know, the first chunk of this talk on that question of using burned areas as natural experiments to study initiation thresholds for debris flows. And then I'm going to spend the second half of the talk answering a couple of questions. Once we have that figured out, we're gonna use that knowledge to kind of talk about how, where, and why does fire impact process dominance. And when I say process dominance, I mean a switch from water-dominated flow or floods to debris flows, and how long does fire impact these types of processes. And then a question that's becoming increasingly important as fire regimes change throughout the Western US and throughout the world is the response to future fires actually dependent on the timing and severity of past fires? So is there memory in the system? So we'll address those questions kind of quickly in the second half of the talk. So first I wanna convince you that burned areas are great natural laboratories for studying runoff generated debris flows. So like I mentioned, I invite you to think more generally. This isn't just about fire. These types of debris flows can and do initiate fairly frequently in other types of steep landscapes, particularly alpine environments where there isn't a lot of natural vegetation. So even though I'm going to talk about fire, this is more generally a talk about a large subset of debris flows that occur in unburned areas as well. But the reason why burned landscapes are particularly helpful for studying this process is that a lot of runoff gets generated in burned areas. And there's several reasons for that. One is that there's a decrease in rainfall interception after fires. Here, obviously, one side of the ridge was burned, the other side wasn't. So we've, in this case, completely lost the canopy. So, you know, normally some of the rain that falls on this landscape will get held on the canopy. It'll evaporate back into the atmosphere. It will never reach the soil to even have the ability to generate runoff. In burned landscapes, more water reaches the soil surface, and what does run off doesn't have to go through this maze of litter and duff and you know, decaying organic material that's on the forest floor, because most of that has been incinerated. And so we have really low hydraulic roughness, which leads to very fast overland flow that can be more erosive and kind of concentrate in the channels more rapidly. This is a video illustrating another impact of fire, one that's very often cited as being a predominant reason for generating post-fire debris flows. And we'll go back to this later on to talk a little bit more about how important or not it may be. But soils in burned landscapes can often, though not always, be extremely water repellent. And this is an example of an extremely unscientific experiment that I conducted after the sand fire, which is in the San Gabriel Mountains, where I'm just squirting some water out of my water bottle onto the hill slope. And you see that that water's not going anywhere. It's a little bit windy, so this blob of water is kind of oscillating back and forth here. But you know, it's pretty unwilling to infiltrate. There's a little bit of an ash layer on top here. So some of the water that hits a little higher, that's infiltrating into the ash. But when you get down to the mineral soil, you're getting essentially no infiltration. And I had to stop the video at some point, but I think we sat here and watched this while we made other measurements, and 10, 15 minutes later, it was still sitting there on the hill slope. So we just left. But this water repellency can be pretty amazing and pretty persistent. All of this leads, not surprisingly, to a lot more erosion than you would typically see. And in addition to there just being more runoff, there's often lower entrainment thresholds for sediment in burned landscapes for a number of reasons, but partly because severe fire tends to incinerate all the fine roots that kind of bind the soil together, as well as some of the organic material that does that too. So you get large increases in the erodibility of the soil. And you end up with a lot of rilling and gullying on hill slopes like you see here, even after just a couple months with one or two, maybe fairly typical rainstorms. I want to emphasize too, before I go any farther, that not all fires are created equal. And in fact, fires affect different parts of the landscape very differently. If you've driven up Mount Lemmon recently, you might ask, well, it doesn't really look like there's that much of a fire here. And it depends on where you're looking. Certain areas where there's low severity fire, you might just see some charred material on the ground. Maybe the trunks of the trees lower down will be scorched. And all of these effects that I've talked about are not as extreme, or they may even be absent in areas that burned at low severity. But in other parts of the burned area that burned a little bit hotter, and you get moderate to high severity fire, there you see the types of effects like we have here on the right. And these factors that I'm talking about, soil water repellency, lack of canopy interception, low hydraulic roughness, all of these things are extremely relevant in these types of burn settings. So every fire has kind of a different mosaic pattern of burn severities across the landscape. But for this first part of the talk, I'm really focused on areas where these effects are pretty extreme. So you can think of something more like what we have here on the right with moderate or high severity fire. This is an example of a runoff generated debris flow that we caught with a hunting camera that was taking time-lapse photos every minute. This was at a burn site in New Mexico. So obviously, there's no flow here normally, but pretty quickly after it starts raining, you start to see a raging torrent that then takes out a couple trees, turns into a pretty large, flood. And then with the amount of sediment that it was carrying, something that I would classify as a debris flow. I'll play this one more time. These photos are taken every minute, so this happens extremely quickly. And one thing that I want to point out is that oftentimes you'll see this transition from water flow and kind of mundane runoff to a debris flow and then back to water dominated flow within the same rainstorm. So this is something that's fairly common. And it means that we may be able to use this information that we're capturing to kind of understand the hydrologic conditions that are associated with that transition. We let lab experiments guide us in what we were looking at. And the place that we started was by looking at a variable called dimensionless discharge that some small scale experiments have identified as being relevant to this transition from water flow to debris flow. And in short, essentially, this dimensionless discharge, the two things that I want you to take away from this, even if I don't expect you to remember this equation, but when I talk about discharge, I'm talking about, in a really simplified setting, if you're looking at a channel that's 1 meter wide, then I'm just talking about the amount of flow, the amount of water that's moving through a given cross section of that channel in a second. And so it's essentially the depth average velocity multiplied by the flow depth. So if you increase velocity and keep flow depth constant, you increase your discharge. Same with increasing depth and keeping velocity constant, you're increasing your discharge. And the other variable that's relevant here is a D50 grain size or a median grain size. So looking at this plot over here, what these folks identified was that if they had low values of dimensionless discharge, then they were unlikely to see a debris flow. But if we just kind of focus in on one particular slope here, say 20 degrees, as we increase the dimensionless discharge, so we're increasing flow depth or we're increasing flow velocity, eventually we're going to get to a point where we transition into having debris flows instead of kind of grain by grain fluvial transport of sediment. If we increase our D50 grain size, then in order to kind of hit the same dimensionless discharge, we need to increase either the flow depth or the flow velocity. So that makes sense. If you have larger grains that you need to move, then in order to get a debris flow, you need more water, or it's got to be moving faster. And if you have greater slopes, then you can generate debris flows with less water or with larger grain sizes. So we kind of took this and said, okay, well, can we use this type of framework, this dimensionless discharge, to predict when we're going to get these types of transitions at the watershed scale? And we started out by trying to assess this in Southern California in the San Gabriel Mountains. One reason why this is a particularly great site to do this type of work is that it's normally very hard to constrain D50 for a landscape. It's pretty variable, or can be in a lot of places. But the nice thing about the San Gabriel Mountains is they are so incredibly steep in many places, at least the hill slopes, that vegetation is actually responsible for holding up a lot of fine hill slope sediment. And when a fire rolls through and incinerates that vegetation, a lot of that sediment then through dry avalanching processes gets dislodged and moves down into the channel. So this is actually a low order channel here that we're looking at, and it's just completely inundated with this fine hill slope sediment that's kind of raveled down in here even before the first rainstorm. And we can pretty easily characterize the D50 of this. It's fairly uniform, and it's kind of present throughout the channel network initially after the fire. So we kind of use this in combination with a bunch of other monitoring and field measurements that we needed, quantifying the rainfall associated with each storm, monitoring the hydrologic response at the outlet of this channel. And we were able to capture the timing of debris flows using laser stage meters, geophones, and a video camera. So you can see here, a screenshot of one of the debris flow surges that came out of this watershed. You can see this really bouldery front right here. So we had very precise timing of exactly when these debris flows were occurring. And we had all of the information and the measurements that we needed in order to calibrate a hydrologic model for this watershed. So the reason why this is helpful is that if we have observations of the rainfall intensity, we know the flow depth at the outlet, we're able to calibrate a model, which is what you see here, this red line comparing the model, the flow depth at the outlet with the observed flow depth. We know the timing of the debris flow, which is the blue line. Then we can ask the question, well, what are the hydrologic conditions throughout the watershed 5 minutes prior to when we observed this debris flow at the outlet? So this is, just kind of a first order estimate of when we think these debris flows are forming. If we're seeing them at the outlet at a given time, then a couple minutes earlier, that's probably when they're first starting to initiate. And we can use the model to predict exactly what that, or at least to estimate what that discharge is throughout the watershed during that time period. And we can do that for a number of storms. So we have a number of observations here. There were 11 different debris flow, 11 or 12 different debris flows that were generated in the first couple months after this fire, and we had timing of debris flows with to within seconds. And so we took all of these storms and simulated runoff throughout the watershed during these specific time periods. And I summarized that information here. So what we're looking at is dimensionless discharge in this time immediately prior to when we see debris flows at the outlet. And I binned this data as a function of slope to kind of give me an idea. Since I know slope varies throughout this watershed, this kind of gives me an idea of what the discharge is in different locations. So higher up here, kind of in these gullies where the slope is really high, the discharges that I'm reporting out here are kind of representative of what's going on in those areas. And then down here where these slopes are low, that's kind of representative of what's going on in these higher order channels down here by the outlet of this, roughly half square kilometer watershed. And in addition to that, we can take all of the storms where we know there were no debris flows, and we can simulate the peak dimensionless discharge during all of those storms and look at that as a function of slopes. That's what you see here with the blue dots. And you'll notice that there's some separation. So the transition from flood to debris flows probably lives somewhere in between these two sets of data here. And so you can kind of, you can use machine learning or different statistical methods to kind of objectively define where that threshold should sit given this data. So that's what we did. And we get a function that looks fairly similar in form to what the experiments suggest, which is something that looks like this. So a slope-dependent value of dimensionless discharge. Again, with the key variables here being a unit discharge, so flow depth times flow velocity, and then a D50 grain size. But you know, we were a little bit. This was a great first pass, but we were slightly unsatisfied. You know, with just wanting to add more data. So how universal is this threshold? If we take this and we go somewhere completely different, we go to a burned area in New Mexico, or we go to an unburned area, you know, in the Alps or something where we see runoff generated debris flows, is this still going to work? And, you know, there's some gaps in here where it's kind of hard to objectively define this threshold. So we needed more data. And this is something that's ongoing work that we're still working on. But in all of the fire sites that we go to now, we try to collect data where we can constrain the timing of debris flows within rainstorms, as well as the data that allows us to calibrate the types of hydrologic models that we need to estimate the dimensionless discharge associated with the timing of those flows. So this is one example of kind of how we do that. We'll drill into bedrock channels and install pressure transducers. What you see here is not the pressure transducer, but the drill bit that we use. So then we'll recess the pressure transducer down into these holes that we drill in the bedrock channels. And we'll also install rain gauges so that we can determine rainfall intensity as a function of time during each storm. And then when a debris flow rolls over one of these pressure transducers, there's usually a large and rapid increase in pressure associated with that. And you get something that looks like what we see down here, where we have on the top rainfall intensity. So you see the storm ramping up, you see the intensity going up, and down here, the pressure kind of slowly responds because there's a little bit of a trickle of runoff. And then all of a sudden you get this really sharp increase, and that increase is associated with a debris flow front passing over that sensor. And so we know that this debris flow was triggered at this time and at a rainfall intensity of 55 millimeters an hour. So this is how we've been going about getting more and more data. We've been doing this, you know, at fire sites that we have in Arizona and New Mexico. This is one example from Carissa Raymond's master's work that she completed last year at the Pinal Fire near Globe. We've also gotten data from collaborators from the 2009 station fire in California, data from unburned sites in Italy, as well as unburned sites in Colorado. And we've been able to fill in some of these data gaps that we have and kind of more rigorously define this threshold. And like I said, this is still work in progress. So we don't have a new threshold yet, but it's something that Hui, my former postdoc, Hui is working on. And this, you know, shows you these dots here are kind of roughly what the new threshold is going to look like. The dashed line is the old threshold that we derived using just the data from California. And you can see that, you know, it'll change probably by a little bit, but it's not going to change by a lot, which is encouraging. So one reason why I'm really excited about this framework is that I think that we can use it to help us in certain hazard applications where we don't have a lot of data to kind of understand the rainstorms that typically trigger debris flows, which is something that emergency managers and the National Weather Service rely on in order to make decisions and issue warnings. So what's typically done is something like this. So you'll make observations at a burned area where you have rainfall intensity observations, and you know by observations after the fact whether or not a debris flow was generated during a specific storm. And so you end up with data that looks like this, where we have rainfall intensity here on the y-axis, and then observations of did you get a debris flow or did you get a flood? So debris flows in yellow, floods in blue. And then you can use a variety of methods. We usually use something called receiver operator characteristic analysis to objectively determine where you would place a threshold if you kind of want a line that delineates the change in process from flood to debris flow. In this case, that would occur at about 42 millimeters an hour. And so we gathered this data from a site in the Gila National Forest in New Mexico. And so you might think, okay, well, for landscapes similar to this, we could apply a threshold of 42 millimeters an hour to kind of use as a warning threshold for when people should look out for debris flows. The problem with this is that there's a lot of ecosystems and different plant communities that are becoming exposed to fire that haven't been exposed to fire in the past. One of them is the Sonoran Desert. So that's a problem. We don't have historical data of when debris flows have occurred in these plant communities. And so we don't know how they respond to fire. We don't have the data to define a threshold. And there's also post-fire hazards that exist now in areas that were previously undeveloped because the wildland-urban interface is shrinking. People are moving into areas that are more exposed to fire and post-fire hazards. We don't have observations from those areas. There's also an issue with, as landscapes recover, we don't have a sufficient observations from years 2, 3, and 4 after a fire to know what the thresholds are there. We just simply don't have enough data. So we were kind of seeking other methods that we could try to fill in some of these gaps without necessarily needing to collect data at all of these sites. So what I'm going to kind of go through next is a method that we came up with to use this dimensionless discharge threshold to estimate or infer what a rainfall threshold should be. And the benefit of this is that we can do it with a hydrologic model. So as long as you have the information to constrain the hydrologic model, you can estimate what a rainfall threshold should be. You don't need historical observations of storms that produced debris flows and storms that didn't produce debris flows. The basic methodology for doing this is that you can go out and make measurements that you need of soil infiltration capacity, the capacity of the canopy, if there is any, to store rainfall in those types of measurements. You can then simulate what the response of your watershed would be to different rainstorms that you can design, and then compute peak values of dimensionless discharge that would result from a given storm, and then summarize it like I have over here on the right, where we're looking at dimensionless discharge binned as a function of slope throughout this watershed. The dashed line is the threshold. So you'll note that typically values of discharge in this watershed are below the threshold. So I would conclude that this storm is not intense enough to produce debris flows in this watershed. So we kind of tested this methodology out at a site in New Mexico, the one that I was just talking about, where we had kind of empirically determined that this threshold should be about 42 millimeters an hour. But we had also made all the measurements that we needed to constrain one of these hydrologic models. And we were able to do that in areas that burned at different severities. So that'll come into play a little bit later. But like I said, often there's kind of a mosaic of burn severities throughout the landscape. So it's important to be able to quantify and calibrate or calibrate your model in these different areas. So here's kind of what you get if we take a small watershed that we had instrumented that I uncreatively called Basin I. All of my colleagues give me a hard time about naming watersheds, really boring things. So if anybody has exciting naming conventions for your geologic mapping or anything like that, let me know. My collaborators will be thrilled. But so here we take a rainstorm with a peak intensity of 20 millimeters an hour. And we simulate what the dimensionless discharge would be throughout this watershed. It's generally below our threshold line. So 20 millimeters an hour is insufficient to cause debris flows in this watershed. If we up this to 25 millimeters an hour, we're still generally below the line. And so that's, I would also say, insufficient. When we get up to 30 millimeters an hour, we're crossing that line in more than 50% of our watershed. And we would conclude here that we're likely to produce debris flows. So we would call our threshold, our rainfall threshold for this specific watershed, 30 millimeters an hour. Now, there's a number of watersheds here that we monitored, and here's this mosaic of burn severity patterns that I was talking about. So we would expect that since different we might get more runoff from the moderate and high severity areas relative to the low severity areas. Some watersheds are steeper or less steep than others. This is going to affect their threshold. And so we went through this modeling exercise with 6 of these watersheds and derived different thresholds for each of them. And then we took the observations and kind of said, asked, well, how well does this do? Are we actually predicting with these thresholds? Are we accurately predicting when we see that transition from flood to debris flow? And we got reasonably good results. So our true positive rate was 0.7. True negative rate is 0.97, which means we're generally doing pretty well. True positive rate is the number of true positives given these thresholds divided by the total number of positives in the whole data set. When we look at what would happen if we use the empirical threshold of 42 millimeters an hour as a constant everywhere across all these watersheds, then we do essentially the same, true positive rate of 0.65 instead of 0.7 and a true negative rate that's the same, 0.97. So I think that this method works pretty well. The caveat is that you need to have the information necessary to calibrate a hydrologic model, which isn't always easy. It requires definitely some observations and measurements on the ground. So it at least gives you an option, though, to be able to estimate these thresholds in areas where you otherwise would have no recourse for knowing them because you don't have the data. Now that we kind of have this tool that we can use, this dimensionless discharge threshold that appears to be portable, at least outside of California, it worked fairly well in New Mexico. We can use it to try to address a couple of these questions. And so this is kind of what I want to focus on for the next 10 minutes or so. And the first one of these is how, where, and why does fire impact process dominance? And a lot of this has to do, like I mentioned, with fires being different everywhere. Often, we see potentially large variations from fire to fire in burn severity. And so one key question is understanding how and why soil burn severity affects if you get a transition from floods to debris flows. There's all of these factors that we've already talked about that we think are different between these two types of burn severity areas. And so we can use a set of modeling experiments to kind of help us understand which of these factors are more or less important. So we start with this one watershed here, Basin A, that was burned pretty much, almost entirely at low severity. And we derived a threshold of 70 millimeters an hour given that low burn severity condition. But if you just kind of hypothetically assume that this entire watershed burned at moderate to high severity, you get a threshold of 35 millimeters an hour. And so we set up a series of model experiments to kind of understand what was driving that change in threshold. And if you assume that that canopy is completely gone from the low severity area, then you get a decrease in that threshold by 65 millimeters an hour. So canopy storage, which will be gone in moderate to high severity areas, isn't all that important. It changes the threshold by 5 millimeters an hour, which is not that much. If we decrease the infiltration capacity of the soil to be consistent with what we saw in the moderate to high severity areas, then we get a further drop of 10 millimeters an hour. And so this is things like maybe more extreme water repellency. So that makes a difference, and it makes more of a difference than the canopy storage capacity in this case. But the thing that made the largest difference, which surprised us a lot, was reductions in hydraulic roughness. So this is something that's responsible for potentially increasing the velocity of the flow in the channels, all else being equal. It's something that's often mentioned in post-fire studies, but it's difficult to quantify, and it's often not quantified. One of the key takeaways here was that this is a variable that we should kind of try to constrain a little bit better and more frequently in post-fire studies, because it could have as much or more of an impact on changing process dominance as things that we often talk about, like soil water repellency and canopy interception. And then, another question is, how long do we have to worry about heightened hydrologic and geomorphic responses from burn scars? And, you can see here just how much of a difference there is between 2 months post-fire and 13 months post-fire. This is the Pinal fire near Globe. You can see the landscape already greening up. some grasses and shrubs starting to come back. And our way of kind of approaching this problem was to make a series of these measurements that we need to constrain our models as a function of time at several different sites. So this is one site where we'll set up transects like you see here, and we'll measure soil infiltration properties. We will do surveys of ground cover and canopy cover so that we can constrain, at least have some sense of how roughness and canopy, capacity may be changing. And we track those through time. And here's one example, of what this means at this site in California, where we see differences in D50 grain size in the channel as this kind of finer hill slope sediment gets eroded away and we expose these larger cobbles and boulders. We get a lot of regrowth that influences roughness on the landscape, and we change soil hydraulic properties. What does this translate into when you put it all together in terms of how that's going to influence a debris flow threshold? This is what you get at 3 sites where we've made these same measurements. This is a figure from Olivia Hoke, who's working on this as part of her ongoing master's project. And so you can see here that she's got 3 study sites, one in California, one in Arizona, one in New Mexico. And we see here these thresholds, the rainfall intensity thresholds, increase pretty substantially at all of the sites as we go from year 1 to year 3. Obviously variations in how quickly they respond to different types of recovery. But to put this into perspective, here's a 1-year recurrence interval storm associated with each of these sites. So in all cases, a storm that might happen every year is sufficient to produce a debris flow, which may be hazardous and is definitely it's probably gonna move a lot of sediment. By the time we get to year 2, it's taking storms that have a recurrence interval of maybe 5 years, or maybe even a little bit more, before we're able to cross that transition and start producing debris flows. And then by year 3, it takes a 25-year recurrence interval storm, or maybe even more, before we're able to cross that transition. So these landscapes all appear to recover fairly quickly if you look at it that way in terms of storm recurrence interval that's required to generate something that would be hazardous. And then kind of lastly here, I want to go over a question that I think is really interesting, especially given what we've seen in Arizona, which is, does the response to future fires depend on the timing and severity of past fires? So you might be looking at this figure on the right thinking, well, why did he include this? This looks like a mess. I can't even tell what's going on here. And that's pretty much exactly what I would like you to think. It's a mess. This is a plot of all of the burn perimeters near Los Angeles from 2002 to 2018. So this doesn't even include all the fires that happened in the last 2 years. And you can see all kinds of overlapping perimeters in here. So we're not talking about, fires that are happening once every 50 years, once every 100 years. These landscapes are burning at a pretty frequent rate, so that they're likely not fully recovered by the time they experience another fire. So maybe a landscape can withstand one perturbation and then recover and withstand another. But what happens if we're repeatedly perturbing the system before it has a chance to kind of return to its, quote, normal state? Maybe there isn't even a normal state. But these landscapes are likely not fully recovering. We see this not only in California. This happened at the Bighorn fire too. Some of you that have been in Tucson long enough probably remember the 2002 Bullock fire, the 2003 Aspen fire. The Bighorn fire reburned a large chunk of both of those burn scars. And so that's 17, 18 years apart. A couple of years ago, we saw something very similar on Mount Graham in the Pinaleños, where the 2017 Fry fire reburned a large chunk of the 2004 Nuttall-Gibson complex fire. You see the 2 overlapping burn perimeters here. A lot of the Fry fire burned at fairly low severity. And so, to be honest, I didn't think that too much was going to happen there. And then, to my surprise, it was a pretty active monsoon season in terms of the number of debris flows. If you've ever driven up Mount Graham, this is the road that you're looking at right here. Near the outlet, near where Wet Canyon crosses the road, there's a hairpin turn here. and there used to be a picnic area, which is obviously not there anymore. But there's a meter deep of mud and boulders and debris here on the road. And large chunks of the Fry fire, like I said, were burned at low severity. We don't typically see this type of response from low severity fires. And we kind of hypothesized that this might be a result of the fact that a lot of these areas burned at moderate to high severity 13, 14 years prior. And so we went out and made a series of measurements to kind of test this in areas that had different burn severities and different burn histories. And what we found was that there were some differences in the infiltration capacity of the soil between areas that had burned once and areas that had burned twice. And you'll see kind of a little glimpse of that here, where there's just some basic simulations looking at discharge at the outlet of a watershed, assuming that watershed just burned once at low severity. You see this small black line, so not a lot of discharge. If it's a reburned area, so an area that burned at moderate or high severity in 2004 and then was burned again in 2017, the response of that watershed to the same pulse of rainfall, it looks more like how a moderate severity watershed would respond than a low severity watershed would respond. And part of the reason for this, was not only differences in soil infiltration capacity, but also differences in canopy and ground cover. So on the left here is an area that didn't burn in 2004 and then burned at low severity in 2017. So you can still see that there's large pine trees here. Their canopies are still green. The fire just kind of crawled through and took out some of the underbrush. Here's an area that burned at moderate severity in 2004 and then low severity in 2017. And you can see here the difference, that the vegetation that came back was still, young aspen trees, fairly low to the ground. And this low severity fire still took out a lot of the canopy. And most of this green stuff that you see here is new growth after the fire. I just didn't get out there fast enough to take pictures. But it was looking pretty bare here in these areas that had burned twice. So this is just to illustrate the importance of these repeated disturbance events, maybe even more impactful than individual disturbance events with long recovery times. One of the things that we're starting to do is to integrate some of these observations and lessons learned about debris flows into landscape evolution models to see how landscapes respond to this change in process from maybe only water sculpting these landscapes to having water and debris flows do the erosion. And so this is really just kind of a hint at some future work that I wanted to at least briefly mention before I wrap up. Just a little teaser of this aspect of the work we're doing. So I'm going to play a video here, and what you're going to see is there's just a block of topography that's being uplifted at a steady rate. And you're going to see channels form and creep in towards the center and kind of migrate headward. And then at 300,000 years into the simulation, you'll see the time up here, I'm going to turn on debris flow erosion. So initially it's only water that's sculpting this landscape. And then I'm just going to instantly let debris flows start also carving channels and eroding bedrock. So what you'll notice is that there's kind of a fairly quick expansion of the low order drainages that kind of widen some of these larger watersheds, a little bit more stochasticity to kind of what's going on in the upper drainage network. So I think that it's, as we move forward with this, now that we kind of have a threshold that tells us where in the landscape we expect to see debris flows forming and where we expect to have water dominated flow, we can start to play some more of these games and look at how introducing these different processes impacts what the landscape looks like and how drainage networks organize and play some of those longer timescale games. So just to wrap up here, a couple of key takeaways. That the initiation of these runoff generated debris flows can be fairly well described by a threshold that's based on dimensionless discharge. In recently burned landscapes, 1-year recurrence interval storms are often sufficient to produce debris flows. but landscapes usually recover fairly quickly, such that after 3 years, it takes really a 25+ year recurrence interval storm to generate that same type of flow. And from a lot of what we've seen, wildfire-induced changes to hydraulic roughness and changes to grain size, D50 grain size, can play substantial roles in changing thresholds in recently burned landscapes. So it goes way beyond just what fire does to soil and some of its obvious effects on infiltration rates to these other factors as well. So if there's any time, I'm happy to take some questions. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Luke. And we do have a time for a quick couple of questions. So you can feel free to type your questions in the chat or raise your hand so you can ask your own questions directly to Luke.
I've got a question, Luke.
Sure.
In the photographs that you showed of debris flow events, I noticed that there was a lot of splashing and things like that. And I'm just curious to know if you have some sort of a cutoff in terms of behavior of these flows. Like some of those things at first glance to me might look like sheet floods or things that are quite fluid and don't have much strong Bingham type behavior. Are you drawing some sort of a finite boundary between those different sets of processes?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question, and it's a constant challenge for us. But yeah, there is really this kind of boundary. If you're looking at a video or looking at time-lapse photos, it can be very challenging to kind of decide whether or not something has more of the character of a debris flow or a water-dominated flow. And you know, the best way to assess that is really by getting out in the field and looking at the deposits. And so that's really what we rely on most of all. The photos and the cameras, you know, they help a lot because we can't always visit these sites as frequently as we would like to, and that can kind of help us sort out what we see downstream of these sites and the deposits. But for the most part, we're going out and we're field verifying whether or not we see debris flow deposits or flood deposits. And, you know, some ways that we can kind of differentiate between them are that debris flow deposits tend to be very poorly sorted. They don't have the clasts oriented in any particular direction. Along the channels, debris flows tend to leave levees as that coarse material kind of gets pushed to the side. Floods don't really leave levees like that. So we look for levees and we look for certain features in the deposits to help us decide whether or not it was a flood or a debris flow.
Thanks.
Luke, Gilby's got a question in the chat. I'm going to read it out. He says, great talk, Luke. Typically, when we consider the climate tectonics interface over geological time, we suggest that as we get wetter climate, that corresponds to increased erosion. But you suggest that it's as if you need a climate which is more seasonal, hot, dry summers with fire and cold, wet winters for increased rainfall. So do your findings have implications for longer timescales?
Yeah, I think it is more complicated than wetter equals more erosion. And so I do think that there are implications of this type of work for trying to understand that, you know, interactions between climate and erosion. And, you know, one example of that is in the Catalina Mountains. So Ann Uberg and others from the Arizona Geological Survey have gone out and mapped a lot of debris flow deposits kind of in the foothills at the base of the Catalinas. And they've done some dating of those flows. And one of their conclusions was that a lot of those flows kind of came off the mountain at times where there was a transition actually from wetter to drier. And part of the reasoning for that is that there's a change in land cover. And along with that change in climate, you're getting less land cover, more bare area, more opportunities for erosion. So even in the absence of fire, I think that can happen. But yeah, certainly if you change the seasonality or you change things such that you're getting more frequent disturbances, whether that's fire or drought, anything that changes land cover has the potential to change erosion rates.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Luke. That was great.